I rise today to support H.R. 2835, the Border Jobs for Veterans Act of 2015. This bill, which I introduced in June, seeks to increase the hiring of military veterans for Customs and Border officer positions vital to our security here at home. The Border Jobs for Veterans Act addresses two critical priorities: ensuring full staffing at our ports of entry and helping separating service members transition to civilian life. My district includes over 80 miles of the U.S. border, as well as several ports of entry. I've visited our ports in Nogales and Douglas numerous times to hear about their operations firsthand and have seen the critical law enforcement duties carried out by CBP officers at these ports, such as screening visitors, returning U.S. citizens, and cargo entering the United States. In June, the Port Authority Chair for the Mariposa Port of Entry in Nogales, just outside my district, reported that while staffing numbers have grown nationally, staffing numbers at the Nogales and Tucson sector have remained essentially stagnant in recent memory while demand continues to grow. The port also estimates that CBP's Tucson field office is currently operating at 20% staffing deficit. While new hires have occurred since then, CBP estimates the Tucson field office still needs to fill roughly 200 officer positions. In my conversations with CBP officers, they have repeatedly told me that inadequate staffing levels hamper their ability to do their jobs. They cite problems with recruiting and retention of new officers, as well as lengthy and cumbersome hiring process, including delays due to backlogs of the necessary background checks. After a recent reduction in that process by roughly 50%, it still takes 180 days to hire a new officer at ports where there is a strong need now. These hurdles to hire act as impediment to cross-border trade that powers both Arizona and the nation's economy. According to the Arizona-Mexico Commission, more than $41.6 billion worth of trade flows through Arizona's ports of entry, $16 billion of which is attributed to bilateral trade with Mexico. But inadequate staffing ports of entry slows the flow of trade coming across the border, costing businesses millions of dollars and ultimately hurts our attractiveness as a transportation and trade hub, something we simply cannot afford. Each year, approximately 250,000 to 300,000 members of the armed forces separate from military service. I recently visited a Veterans One-Stop Center in Pima County in my district, which helps veterans find employment after they leave the military, and I listened to their challenges and their stories firsthand. Who better to address this shortfall and help to secure our ports than the highly trained, patriotic Americans who just recently separated from the armed forces? That is why H.R. 2835 requires the Secretary of Homeland Security to work with the Department of Defense to enhance our efforts to recruit members of the military who are separating to serve as Customs and Border Protection officers. These efforts must include participation in relevant job fairs, transition programs, partnerships between CBP field offices and local military bases, and identification of ways to streamline the transfer of background checks and security clearances. This bill offers the men and women of our military another opportunity to serve the nation. All DHS has to do is make sure that they are aware of the opportunities available at our nation's 329 ports of entry. I want to thank my colleagues, Senators Flake, McCain, Johnson, and Schumer, and their staffs for working on the Senate companion legislation and their help on the text of this bill. I also want to thank Chairman Thornberry and his staff for working with us to move this bill forward. I ask unanimous consent to include in the record a letter exchange between Chairman McCall and Chairman Thornberry on H.R. 2835.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I urge all members to join me in supporting the Border Jobs for Veterans Act of 2015. And of my time.
Gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of H.R. 2835, the Border Jobs for Veterans Act of 2015, and yield myself at such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I'd like to thank my colleague, Congresswoman McSally, for introducing this wonderful piece of legislation. It not only helps us expedite the flow of traffic and trade at our borders, but it also helps and assists with our veterans whom we all represent, and so I thank you for that. H.R. 2835, the Border Jobs for Veterans Act of 2015, would require the Secretary of Homeland Security to consider expediting the hiring of qualified veterans to serve as U.S. Customs and Border Protection officers. The bill also authorizes DHS to enhance its efforts to recruit members of the armed forces who are separating from military service to serve as CBP officers, and requires DHS to report to Congress on its efforts. Through their service, our nation's veterans have demonstrated their unwavering commitment to our country and its security. CBP would benefit greatly from their service within the agency's ranks. At the same time, expediting the hiring of qualified veterans could help alleviate the continued shortage of CBP officers at our ports of entry, helping to better secure our borders while facilitating legitimate trade and travel. With that in mind, I urge my colleagues to support this important bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from Arizona is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I have no more speakers. If the gentleman from Texas has no further speakers, I am prepared to close once the gentleman does.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting H.R. 2835 to facilitate the recruitment and hiring of America's military veterans for new careers serving our country as U.S. Customs and Border Protection officers. Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The gentlewoman from Arizona is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I once again urge my colleagues to support H.R. 2835. I yield back the